Colin Bodayle is a philosophy professor who somehow teaches people at Villanova University. The truth is, Bodayle is really just your average, bog-standard example of what Nassim Nicholas Taleb in the past has described as an intellectual yet idiot, or IYI. He has a degree which for some reason he mistakes for real intelligence or knowledge. His institutionalized outlook is so out of touch with reality that it leads him to make many stupid claims, such as the idea that nations are not materially real, that open borders is somehow possible within the context of a proletarian dictatorship, communist state, as most people understand, or that an individual can just choose to identify with whatever ethnicity they want to, and somehow acquire that ethnic identity. For many months, he has engaged in obsessive behavior toward the American Communist Party. He believes that his liberal outlook is true Marxism, and that I am, by contrast, merely a Duginist and fascist. Failing to demonstrate this, he was challenged to a live debate. He claimed that due to time constraints and how valuable his time is, he would not do this. Some followers of mine even offered to pay him $500 to debate me in a live setting, and he refused. Instead, he claimed that he was only willing to debate on Twitter, where in fact his time commitment is potentially unlimited. So much for his time being valuable. To be clear, I much prefer to attack and criticize the far right, but Colin would simply not stop attacking us, even as he could see that we were spending the majority of our time pushing back against neo-Nazism and racial cannibalism. After having ignored this rodent for many months, Colin made the fatal mistake of attempting to respond to a post of mine here. The communist view on immigration. First, if they seized power, communists would restrict all unilateral global immigration. No communist state in history had open borders. Immigration would be restricted to countries with bilateral economic agreements to ensure that it is rational and harmonious with national economic plans. Additionally, cultural differences would carefully be taken into account so as to not produce scenarios of misunderstanding, conflict, and confusion that inflame national, ethnic, or religious tensions. This is how, practically, all communist states dealt with immigration, carefully and extremely controlled. Under socialist economic planning, spontaneous and unrestricted mass immigration is impossible. The flow of labor, the settlement of populations, and the patterns of life cannot be treated as a free-for-all when your economy is actually planned in a rational way. But at the same time, communists reject antagonizing immigrants under the current capitalist system. Here are the reasons. 1. Strategically, it makes no sense to give your enemies, the capitalist ruling class, a free base of support. By demonizing immigrants, you drive them into the arms of your enemy. The enemy should always be divided, never given the chance to unite on any basis. 2. It is fruitless. The same cannibal frenzy and instincts that lead people to demonize immigrants will eventually lead to cannibalism and division within the ranks of the national working class, especially in multi-ethnic countries like America. Division within our own ranks cannot be tolerated and must be stamped out ruthlessly. Prioritizing the issue of immigration only builds a movement that is focused on immigrants themselves, not any actual institutional or state policy. We can see that anti-immigrant politics never actually changes the policy. Look at Meloni in Italy. Trump also didn't build the wall. It just whips up duped and distracted idiots into supporting the system. To change any state policy, one must have an impersonal, wise, and collected view. Anti-immigrant hysteria is not conducive to this. 3. It reinforces national chauvinism in the context of U.S. imperial policy. By demonizing Haitian immigrants, for example, consensus is built for more U.S.-led intervention into Haiti. It is also hypocritical and unprincipled to forego responsibility your own government has in enforcing the same global imperialist system that devastates and enslaves other countries, leading to huge refugee populations and economic migrations. To oppose immigration policy while supporting the U.S. global system is a violation of one's own national honor. It is craven, hypocritical, and morally bankrupt. 4. It mistakes the cause for the effect. The chief cause of mass migration is to import a class of foreign slaves so as to enforce the dismantlement of the native power of labor. But the domestic cost of labor has only risen so immensely because rentier parasites have driven up the cost of living to an extraordinary degree. This has led to deindustrialization on a mass scale. Mass immigration is not the chief cause of the destruction of the power of labor, but a symptom of it. Therefore, the focus should be based more on the root cause, which is the domestic struggle for economic sovereignty and emancipation from debt slavery. The more Americans face economic pressure, the more they will be whipped into a frenzy looking for people to hate and to blame. The more resentment will increase. Communists, while having the correct, realistic, and wise position on mass immigration and its root causes, will not lower themselves to this frenzy of stupidity and cannibalism, or somehow confuse it for a principled opposition to the policy of mass immigration.
Here is Colin's reply in another voice to differentiate between the one of Haas. Haas is a LARPer, so he can only cosplay the AES border policy. AES border policies were necessitated by the struggle against U.S. imperialism, and so obviously don't apply to the U.S. Here's a thread on the actual Marxist position on borders. The purpose of the U.S. immigration policy isn't to prevent undocumented immigrants from entering the U.S., but to create a super exploitable class. Undocumented workers aren't protected by minimum wage laws, they can't form unions, and they aren't protected from abuse. There are 11.1 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. Undocumented farm workers make up 41% of workers in the agricultural sector, and 70% of farm workers were not born in the United States. A 2019 study of the wages of undocumented workers in the journal Labor Economics showed that when immigration policies are harsher, the wages of undocumented immigrants fall. When restrictions are loosened, the pay between workers tends to equalize. The lower the wages, the higher the rate of surplus value extraction and the higher the profits. Strict immigration policies are not designed to keep immigrants out, but to keep the price of undocumented labor low. Strict immigration policies also create competition between undocumented workers and other segments of the working class, making the task of organizing labor more difficult. The goal should be to bring these struggles together. The criminalization of undocumented workers also fuels the prison industrial complex. Many private prison corporations, like CoreCivic, have shifted their resources into ICE detention facilities. Anyone fighting for the emancipation of the working class should be fighting for open borders. We need to bring these struggles together as part of a unified movement. Fighting for a better wage means fighting against the bosses, not fighting against other workers.
My first takedown of Colin. I claim that socialism preserves ethnic identity while also facilitating their development, because it is a matter of actual fact that this is what AES states did. Regarding the American national context, we are even more progressive than AES were. Rather than treat America's various racial minorities as separate ethnic identities, we seek to facilitate their unity into a single nation. And no, regarding migration policies in socialist countries, I'm not just talking about the interwar period of the USSR, although it should be noted that migration wasn't simply controlled for security purposes. Avoiding inflaming ethnic tensions and conflicts were also heavily taken into account. This was especially true in the Caucasus region, under Stalin's wise guidance. But in every period of socialism, including in the mature stage, immigration was tightly controlled. To whatever extent it was occurring, it was heavily regulated and controlled. There was never a policy of unconditional and unrestricted borders between socialist fraternal states in the entire history of the Warsaw Pact. Individual migration was never treated the same as mass migration. The latter was vastly more restricted and, when it did occur, heavily planned for. And the context was clear. Socialist countries were planned economies that could not afford the chaos of unrestricted mass migration. Ruling communist parties also sought to prevent ethnic conflict and tension at all cost. Now, what fundamentally is missing? I would be happy to address your deranged and silly gibbering about Heidegger and Dugin if you had the courage to commit to whatever claims you would like to make in a live setting where you cannot ChatGPT your responses. Unfortunately, they are completely irrelevant to the question of migration policy under AES countries, past and present, though I can see why you're trying to pivot from this silly mistake of yours.
Now here is Colin's response. Again in the other voice so you can differentiate. Yes, I know you are obsessed with your own version of identity politics. It's all you and your party talk about. Your notion of ethnic identity is a mystification, a purely ideal category, and it does not correspond to anything materially real. You thus draw off attempts to create an ideology of the ethnos, since none such ideology exists in Marxism, drawing upon thinkers from the conservative revolution tradition like Jünger, Evola, Dugin, and Heidegger. In true Heideggerian fashion, your party's to create an ethnic identity by appealing to history, what Heidegger calls authentic history, which corresponds to what he calls the destiny of the Volk. In your party's case, it's conjuring up a false image of the American founding fathers as some kind of model for communism based off absurd appeals to authority and out-of-context quotes. Marx talked about your strategy in the 18th Brumaire and rightfully condemned it. He wrote, "The social revolution of the 19th century cannot take its poetry from the past, but only from the future. It cannot begin with itself before it has stripped away all superstition about the past. The former revolutions required recollections of past world history in order to smother their own content. The revolution of the 19th century must let the dead bury their dead in order to arrive at its own content." Socialist projects like socialism with Chinese characteristics are not about preserving an ethnic identity, but adapting Marxism-Leninism to the material conditions of the relationships of production in China. In China's case, the peasantry as a proletarian class. Socialism with American characteristics, likewise, would have to adapt to the material conditions of the American proletariat. Historically, AES has overturned the traditions of the past. Consider the liberation of women in AES countries, China ending sexist traditional practices like foot binding, or the attempts of Cuba to combat sexism, homophobia, and transphobia. Of course, AES countries have always respected local traditions and customs that are not contrary to ML philosophy, but to claim that socialism facilitates the development of ethnic identity is idealist crap. Sure, AES states haven't trampled over the cultural identity of ethnic minorities, but they have not grounded socialism in an ethnos. Every instance of immigration being tightly controlled under AES was a result of socialism being under siege, including incidents that aimed to prevent ethnic conflicts, a tool that NATO frequently uses to destabilize governments. Yet just as much as AES countries have allowed for local traditions, they have also aimed to unite these different groups and traditions together under the single banner of socialism. I mean, if you look at the curriculum for so-called socialist patriotic education in China, it primarily focuses on the history of the CPC, MZD thought, DXP thought, and XJP thought, as well as a few cultural things like the meaning of the flag, the national anthem, and knowing some of China's famous natural landmarks. In other words, it means educating people on Marxism.
My second takedown of Colin. To be clear, the actual issue in contention is whether there is a single example of an AES country that has ever had a policy of open borders, even in relation to fraternal socialist nations, or in the case of mass populations, even collectively, or unrestricted mass migration. You claim that every instance of immigration being tightly controlled under AES was a result of socialism being under siege, including incidents that aimed to prevent ethnic conflicts. This is patently false. While imperialist powers did try to exploit ethnic tensions, those tensions were very real, and communist parties carefully took them into account as a very important factor in their governance and policies regarding the flow of populations. Imperialist intrigue was not the sole cause of these tensions. These tensions had deep historical roots, which socialism did not immediately eliminate. Rather, ruling communist parties managed them in such a way so as to facilitate their eventual elimination in the future. This has nothing to do with the national nihilist or liberal cosmopolitan view, which treats immigration, culture, and national realities as purely individual ones. It has nothing to do with the bourgeois view, which is completely blind to the social consequences of exchanges between populations. Your gibber babbling about Jünger, Evola, Dugin, and Heidegger is completely irrelevant, and is little more than a sad form of paranoid schizophrenia. The truth is, the extent to which we regard national realities and their historical basis as a party is basic Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy. And if you were familiar with even the basics of classical Marxist-Leninist writings on the matter, you would be able to see that. But due to your illiteracy with regard to the basic canon of Marxism-Leninism, you resort to chasing ghosts and grasping for straws. You accuse us of taking quotes out of context and then attempt to apply a quote by Marx in defense of national nihilism. You may speculate that Marx was attempting to argue that we should abandon all semblance of continuity with national historical traditions, though a cursory familiarity with his writing reveals that he was actually talking about those attempting to directly emulate the revolutions of the past rather than of the present. It has nothing to do with the fundamental question of historical continuity. And the great part is that we don't need to speculate about what the orthodox Marxist-Leninist view on the matter has been. Let's ask Dimitrov directly.
Voice has changed to differentiate Dimitrov from Chairman Has and Colin Bodayle. The fascists are rummaging through the entire history of every nation so as to be able to pose as the heirs and continuators of all that was exalted and heroic in its past, while all that was degrading or offensive to the national sentiments of the people they make use of as weapons against the enemies of fascism. Hundreds of books are being published in Germany with only one aim: to falsify the history of the German people and give it a fascist complexion. The new-baked National Socialist historians try to depict the history of Germany as if for the past 2,000 years, by virtue of some historical law, a certain line of development had run through it like a red thread, leading to the appearance on the historical scene of a national savior, a messiah of the German people, a certain corporal of Austrian extraction. In these books, the greatest figures of the German people of the past are represented as having been fascists, while the great peasant movements are set down as the direct precursors of the fascist movement. Mussolini does his utmost to make capital for himself out of the heroic figure of Garibaldi. The French fascists bring to the fore as their heroine Joan of Arc. The American fascists appeal to the traditions of the American War of Independence, the traditions of Washington and Lincoln. The Bulgarian fascists make use of the national liberation movement of the 70s and its heroes beloved by the people, Vasilevsky, Stefan Karaj, and others. Communists who suppose that all this has nothing to do with the cause of the working class, who do nothing to enlighten the masses on the past of their people in a historically correct fashion, in a genuinely Marxist-Leninist spirit, who do nothing to link up the present struggle with the people's revolutionary traditions and past, voluntarily hand over to the fascist falsifiers all that is valuable in the historical past of the nation, so that the fascists may fool the masses. No, comrades, we are concerned with every important question, not only of the present and the future, but also of the past of our own peoples. We communists do not pursue a narrow policy based on the craft interests of the workers. We are not narrow-minded trade union functionaries or leaders of medieval guilds of handicraftsmen and journeymen. We are the representatives of the class interests of the most important, the greatest class of modern society, the working class, to whose destiny it falls to free mankind from the sufferings of the capitalist system, the class which in 1/6 of the world has already cast off the yoke of capitalism and constitutes the ruling class. We defend the vital interests of all the exploited, toiling strata, that is, of the overwhelming majority in any capitalist country. We communists are the irreconcilable opponents, in principle, of bourgeois nationalism in all its forms. But we are not supporters of national nihilism, and should never act as such. The task of educating the workers and all working people in the spirit of proletarian internationalism is one of the fundamental tasks of every communist party. But anyone who thinks that this permits him or even compels him to sneer at all the national sentiments of the broad masses of working people is far from being a genuine Bolshevik and has understood nothing of the teaching of Lenin on the national question.
He then goes on to issue a citation from Lenin, who writes clearly.
Again, the voice has changed to differentiate Lenin from Has and Colin. Are we class-conscious great Russian proletarians impervious to the feeling of national pride? Certainly not. We love our language and our motherland. We, more than any other group, are working to raise its laboring masses, i.e. 9/10 of its population, to the level of intelligent Democrats and socialists. We more than anybody, are grieved to see and feel to what violence, oppression, and mockery our beautiful motherland is being subjected by the czarist hangmen, the nobles, and the capitalists. We are proud of the fact that those acts of violence met with resistance in the midst of the great Russians, that this midst brought forth Radishchev, the Decembrists, the intellectual revolutionaries of the 70s, that in 1905, the great Russian working class created a powerful revolutionary party of the masses.
Our willingness to utilize the American revolutionary tradition, moreover, has precedent in this country. It was the basic line of the Communist Party for nearly the entire duration of its existence to draw from the American Revolution of 1776 a source of legitimacy for socialist struggle. Were they, too, guilty of reading too much Ernst Jünger? You silly, pathetic fool. You claim that socialism with American characteristics would have to adapt to the material conditions of the American proletariat. But as Stalin writes lucidly in Marxism and the National Question, national realities, too, are part of these material conditions. According to the basic Marxist-Leninist outlook, nations, too, are materially real. You give examples of socialist countries overturning traditions of the past. By this, you mean basic modernization. But as much as these traditions are overturned, such events participate in the facilitation of the development of the nation, bringing it to a new stage of historical existence, preserving its rational continuity with the past. This has nothing to do with the national nihilism you espouse. You claim that socialism facilitates the development of ethnic identity is idealist crap. Was the new Soviet man idealist crap? The explicit project to facilitate the development of the various peoples of the USSR into a new Soviet national identity? Did this not facilitate the progressive development of various ethnic identities, exposed to the wealth and treasure of various histories and cultures they otherwise would have no way to authentically encounter without the rubbish of past historical conflicts, grievances, and grudges getting in the way? You claim that, yet just as much as AES countries have allowed for local traditions, they have also aimed to unite these different groups and traditions together under the single banner of socialism. Yes, but they do so in a way that is not historically nihilistic, in a way that preserves the histories of various peoples and situates and integrates them within a rational historical continuity that culminates in socialist development. This has nothing to do with the capitalist and nihilistic erasure of traditions, cultures, and peoples you extol as Marxist. Moreover, the extent of your gibbering is quite profound here. I speak of the facilitation of the development of ethnic identity. You call this idealism. Then, just using different words, you attribute the same thing to what AES countries did, almost like you are intentionally interpreting my words in bad faith, because you are just so outraged about the fact that I engage seriously with a diversity of non-Marxist authors to better strengthen the Marxist outlook.
Colin's third response, again in a different voice to differentiate between Colin and Has. Here is his response. The issue in contention is not whether there is a single example of an AES country that has had a policy of open borders. Immigration was encouraged during the first few years of the USSR, but that's beside the point. The issue in contention is what line Marxists in the US should take regarding current immigration policy. The line is to push for legalization of undocumented workers, ending the imperialism and sanctions that produce these conditions, and opening the borders to those seeking asylum from US imperialism. There is also a less pressing issue of what a future society after capitalism should do regarding its borders, which is a utopian question, yet the obvious answer seems to be there wouldn't be borders in full communism. Next, Has makes a very basic error in his reasoning. I claim that AES border policies are a result of socialism under siege. Has claims this is patently false, yet his argument doesn't actually demonstrate this. He asserts that tensions were very real, referring to ethnic tensions within the USSR itself, and then that AES states took them into account, and then says imperialist intrigue was not the sole cause of these tensions. Yet we are not debating about the causes of the tensions, but the causes of the border policies. Even if the tensions pre-exist, and they did, The fact that there were pre-existing ethnic tensions does not imply that the USSR would have engaged in these border policies even without the threat of imperialism. I mean, why would they? Does segregating people ever help resolve ethnic tensions? No. First, there's no reason to think that the US border policy should be based off the USSR's border policies. Second, why should internal segregation have anything to do with the external policies in relation to the USSR's borders with non-USSR countries? But if we carry Haas's argument through to its conclusion, what Haas is basically arguing is that there are ethnic tensions between Latin Americans and people in the US, so we should segregate the Latin Americans from the US to prevent ethnic tensions. So basically, he's calling for segregation based on ethnicity. Yet why does Haas think there are ethnic tensions between the US and Latin America? Are there ethnic tensions between people in the US and Hispanic people? The only ethnic tensions are between white racists and Hispanic people. So clearly, this is a ludicrous argument, but Haas is clever at disguising his meaning through sloppy syllogisms. Speaking of which, Haas likes to introduce false binaries. This has nothing to do with the national nihilist or liberal cosmopolitan view, which treats immigration, culture, and national realities as purely individual ones. Here, Haas switches into a Duginist analysis, specifically the thesis of the fourth political theory that the individualist aspect of liberalism is to be rejected. He also switches into an even more idealist register. Now, we aren't talking about specific policies, but specific ideologies that Haas rejects. Indeed, this has nothing to do with our discussion so far, but Haas really means that it has everything to do with our discussion, which is why he has introduced it in the form of a false binary between what Haas tells us is the Soviet attempt to eventually eliminate ethnic tensions and the national nihilist cosmopolitanism, a set of ideas that Haas wants to attack in idealist fashion. It has nothing to do with the bourgeois view, which is completely blind to the social consequences of exchanges between populations. Then why bring it up? Because this is a rhetorically lazy way to disguise a bad argument. In fact, Haas really wants to claim the bourgeois view is blind to the social consequences of the exchanges between populations. Yet that's not even true. Look at all of the capitalist states who have strict immigration policies, have implemented segregation, or have committed ethnic cleansing. Your gibber-babbling about Junger, Evola, Dugin, and Heidegger is completely irrelevant. This contradicts the statement Haas has pinned to his page. Basic Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy, aka your tenuous reading of Dimitrov, because all you can do is appeal to quotes and the Church of Marxism, which is not a materialist way to proceed at all. Just because Dimitrov said it doesn't mean it's true. Even the basics of classical Marxist-Leninist writings on the matter. Oh, I have read Dimitrov. Due to your illiteracy with regard to the basic canon of Marxism-Leninism. Projection much? I happily admit that there is always I could read, but I have read enough to know when someone hasn't done their homework. You may speculate that Marx was attempting to argue that we should abandon all semblance of continuity with national historical traditions. The working men have no country. Marx, though a cursory familiarity with his writing, reveals that he was actually talking about those attempting to directly emulate the revolutions of the past rather than of the present. No. He actually explicitly says that the revolutions take from the future, not the present. Most of Marx's writings on contemporary revolutions were criticizing their mistakes to understand why they failed and how they could be more successful. The fundamental question of historical continuity. You need to define the term historical continuity and specify what you mean by it. The continuity of what with what? Why should we care about historical continuity? You aren't going to do this because you're taking it from Heidegger. The fascists are rummaging through the entire history of every nation so as to be able to pose as the heirs and continuators of all that was exalted and heroic in its past. Dimitrov is right. Fascist ideology is 100% rooted in historical continuity, which is precisely how you sneak fascist ideology into Marxism. While all that was degrading or offensive to the national sentiments of the people, they make use of as weapons against the enemies of fascism. I mean, kind of like what you do with your transphobia, homophobia. Hundreds of books are being published in Germany with only one aim: to falsify the history of the German people and give it a fascist complexion. Again, sounds like you. Quote, the new-baked National Socialist historians try to depict the history of Germany as if for the past 2,000 years, by virtue of some historical law, a certain line of development had run through it like a red thread, leading to the appearance on the historical scene of a national savior, a messiah of the German people, a certain corporal of Austrian extraction. Unquote. Again, shows that historical continuity is an aspect of fascism. The reason you like this Dmitriev quote is because he clearly articulates the fascist understanding of history and is quite correct in his understanding. You want to make use of fascism, so you use this quote by Dmitriev to justify fusing fascist theories of history with Marxism. I think this clearly shows that Dmitriev made some mistakes in articulating his position. First, he does not clearly distinguish the idealist version of history found in fascism from the materialist theory of history found in Marx, Engels, and Lenin. Second, he says that socialist movements should have heroes, but he fails to specify who should be chosen as heroes. Furthermore, he says a historically correct fashion, which does not mean falsifying the history so that slave-owning members of the ruling class like Washington and Jefferson, who were counter-revolutionaries who opposed workers' movements like Shays' Rebellion or the Haitian Revolution, are suddenly heroes. According to the basic Marxist-Leninist outlook, nations, too, are materially real. No, they aren't. Was the new Soviet man idealist crap? Not an ethnic identity. Did this not facilitate the progressive development of various ethnic identities, exposed to the wealth and treasure of various histories and cultures they otherwise would have no way to authentically encounter without the rubbish of past historical conflicts, grievances, and grudges getting in the way? I advocate for the progressive development of all people who can learn from all of history. This has nothing to do with the capitalist and nihilistic erasure of traditions, cultures, and peoples you extol as Marxist. Nobody wants to erase histories. We want to destroy the superstitions you want to mobilize. The biggest threat to your traditionalist perversion of Marxism is history.
My third takedown of Colin back for more Colin? It's sad how you're just receiving a free education at this point. You could have just done the honorable thing and admit your fundamental illiteracy about the history of AES. Instead, you're trying to salvage your pride getting schooled as a student of mine. Let us consult the record clearly and unequivocally. The original point of contention was not about current U.S. immigration policy, since I was clear about the fact that there is nothing communists can do to affect it, and that it should therefore not be prioritized. The original point of contention was about the history of border and migration policies in AES, and what kind of policies a Communist Party, were it to seize power, would implement in relation to the immigration and border policy. You see, this is fundamentally different than current U.S. immigration policy. The current policy is the policy of an imperialist state machine. The hypothetical policy under contention, by contrast, would be under a proletarian dictatorship. Your inability to follow a basic line of argumentation is remarkable. Later, you claim this is a utopian question. Utopianism is about pre-planning all meticulous details of a future society. The extent of policy I presented would be pretty standard for the program of a Communist Party, which you would know if you were not a fundamentally illiterate dipshit who knows next to nothing about the history of communist politics. Now, advocating for policies under the current regime is a form of agitation. That you believe the content of agitation is identical with some administrative or utilitarian realization of policy, yet again reveals the Lovecraftian depths of your ignorance, not only about the basic history of communist organization, but even what was standard for the late 19th century social democrats. Agitating for policies under an imperialist dictatorship is not primarily about actually passing the policy, but creating the context for building a movement and accentuating contradictions of importance within the consciousness of the people. You put the cart before the horse, establish yourself as a wise policymaker who will pass policies that will benefit the movement, without any strategy about how you will actually make this popular among the masses themselves, who are necessary for passing the policy in the first place. You claim the debate is not about the cause of tensions, but about the cause of border policy. But this is pure sophistry, since you attempted to imply that, absent imperialist intrigue, the tensions would not have needed to be carefully managed, since no one would be there to exploit, effectively rendering them practically non-existent. And because you claimed that imperialist intrigue was the sole cause of border policies, this must mean that tensions were primarily the consequence of imperialist intrigue. This is basic logic, Colin, but I know it isn't your strong suit. The fact that there were pre-existing ethnic tensions does not imply that the USSR would have engaged in these border policies even without the threat of imperialism. If you carefully study Soviet policy on managing the differences and tensions between various ethnicities, and if you study the history of inter-ethnic disputes within the USSR, you will find that imperialist intrigue was not necessary for misunderstandings, confusions, and offenses to national sentiment to lead to social instability. The latter was prevented, time and time again, because of the wise management of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which was always sensitive to these issues. Does segregating people ever help resolve ethnic tensions? No. The fact that you are attempting to twist Soviet national policy into segregation reveals the large extent of your liberal individualism. No policy of segregation was necessary for the fact that Soviet people, by and large, tended to live within historically constituted communities with a common culture, language, and shared historical background. This was not some exception that needed to be enforced. It was the norm. Socialist planning did not violently uproot people from their historically constituted communities. So issues pertaining to basic economic planning, such as employment, distribution, settlement, etc., was fundamentally intertwined with pre-existing historically constituted ethnic and national communities. As such, people could not mix together in an uncontrolled way. That is not to say they couldn't mix together at all. Moscow, to this day, remains an incredibly diverse city, but they could do so only on the basis of socialist planning, responsibility, and management. In other words, on a collective rather than individual basis. On a basis that took into account differences, and on the basis of these differences, rather than at their expense, established genuine and authentic forms of contact and exchange between different peoples. The icing on the cake is that, in the first place, I mentioned mass migration. Second, why should internal segregation have anything to do with the external policies in relation to the USSR's borders with non-USSR countries? To be clear, what I said is that no AES has ever had a policy of open borders, and this was not simply due to security reasons, because they neither had open borders with each other, fraternal socialist nations, nor even on an internal basis as it pertained to different ethnicities. You started talking about segregation because you are little more than a common liberal. If we carry Haz's argument through to its conclusion, what Haz is basically arguing is that there are ethnic tensions between Latin Americans and people in the U.S., so we should segregate the Latin Americans from the U.S. to prevent ethnic tensions. I have no idea why you would lie like this when everyone can see the record clearly. I never actually called for segregation or even unconditionally closed borders, but control, regulation, and management in a way that took into account the economic implications as well as potential cultural misunderstandings between differently historically constituted populations. Once again, that was the standard policy of all AES countries. Under a proletarian dictatorship, different historically constituted peoples would be able to fuse together, exchange, and possess genuine solidarity on a basis that recognized rather than liquidated their histories, languages, and cultures. This is by treating the issue collectively rather than individually. By contrast, under liberalism, mass migration has the effect of alienating people, both immigrants and citizens, from any sense of collective solidarity or existence. No proper procedures for introducing strangers, no proper ability to understand others, no fairly established economic rationale, no control, no regulation. Obviously, and coupled with the existing economic alienation, this breeds wild forms of resentment and conflict. And for all that, what does it breed? The most stark forms of segregation and ghettoization in modern history. Controlling exchanges between population is not segregation, and we can all see how you are attempting to invoke the Jim Crow era here. On the contrary, only on the basis of socialist planning and control can different populations engage in genuine cultural exchange. Under the liberal policy you currently champion, and also seem to propose for a future proletarian dictatorship, cultural exchange actually becomes extremely limited. How can people who speak different languages ever understand each other without a translator? The role of a communist party is to be the translator. That requires, first of all, recognizing different languages and peoples on a collective rather than individual basis. Haas is clever at disguising his meaning through sloppy syllogisms. The professor seems to confuse a basic line of argumentation for a syllogism. It sounds like you are the one attempting to consult the formalistic terms of propositional logic to follow here. All I have to do, meanwhile, is just be honest about the actual facts of history. Here, Haas switches into a Duginist analysis, specifically the thesis of the fourth political theory that the individualist aspect of liberalism is to be rejected. I actually just quoted Georgy Dimitrov, General Secretary of the Communist International. Would you like me to quote Soviet introductory textbooks on Marxism-Leninism so that you can know what communists actually had to say about the individualistic aspect of liberalism? That Dugin might agree with this is not particularly relevant. Your silly line of argumentation is as follows. The underlying super-rational secret behind Haas's arguments is none other than Dugin. This is a sad form of paranoid schizophrenia and psychoses. You cannot actually address the arguments according to their content, namely the correct depiction of the facts of history, the basic and orthodox Marxist-Leninist outlook as it pertains to the national question, socialist patriotism, etc. So you have adopted a form of psychosis where you can attribute your own inability to rationally engage with what I am saying to a secret magician, Dugin. The truth is, everything I have said is consistent with the facts of history and with the basic orthodox Marxist-Leninist outlook on the matter, both in theory and in practice. You are just clearly trying to pivot from the argument at hand because you're losing badly. False binary between what Haas tells us is the Soviet attempt to eventually eliminate ethnic tensions and the national nihilist cosmopolitanism, a set of ideas that Haas wants to attack in idealist fashion. Was Dimitrov too guilty of this false binary? Was he too guilty of attacking national nihilism and cosmopolitanism in idealist fashion? You then go on to claim that my argument is bad, and the reasoning you provide is that you think segregation and ethnic cleansing are examples of the bourgeoisie carefully taking into account the social consequences of exchanges between populations. But racial segregation and ethnic cleansing are actually profoundly antisocial, Colin, because they deny, oppress, or even exterminate historically constituted communities wholesale. Such savage policies reflect the inability to recognize any kind of real social being and reduce peoples to the narrow metaphysical terms of race. This, in fact, has nothing to do with being sensitive to the social consequences of exchanges between different populations, Colin. This contradicts the statement Haas has pinned to his page. No, it doesn't. The extent to which I engage with Dugin or Heidegger elsewhere has absolutely nothing to do with the issue under contention right now. There is no need to read any Dugin or Heidegger to grasp the correctness of my position here. It is really just orthodox Marxism-Leninism. It's so sad that your illiteracy is so profound, you can't even recognize that. After days, one would have thought that you would have actually read up on some actual Marxist-Leninist literature. Instead, you continue to tweak about Dugin. Just sad. Just because Dimitrov said it doesn't mean it's true. So we have changed the goalposts. At first, nothing Haas was saying had anything to do with Marxism-Leninism. It was rather just Duginism. Now, Haas's position is actually the same as that of the General Secretary of the Comintern, but Colin has decided that it's actually Dimitrov who is wrong, and Colin, in his infinite genius, who just discovered who Dimitrov was because Haas mentioned him, is correct. But what you have done to demonstrate the correctness of your position? Nothing. Oh, I have read Dimitrov. To be clear, ladies and gentlemen, this is what someone says when they have, in fact, not read any Dimitrov. You quote Marx, who says, "The working men have no country, Marx." Marx was correct. Capitalism profoundly alienated the proletariat from their national existence, history, and homeland. Now let us read what he wrote shortly afterwards. Since the proletariat must first of all acquire political supremacy, must rise to be the leading class of the nation, must constitute itself the nation, it is so far itself national, though not in the bourgeois sense of the word. Now, it is definitely true that Marx and Engels believed that the proletarian revolution would more or less eventually lead to the dissolution of all national differences. Marxists afterwards long believed that a proletarian revolution would be a single simultaneous event of all nations, leading to the constitution of a higher international form of historical existence. But notice, even this was not cosmopolitanism. It was thought to be the culmination of all national histories, rather than their negation. And while even Lenin understood the reality of unevenness, even he believed, before the experience of the October Revolution, the success of socialist construction would hinge upon an international revolution. This is one of the reasons that the synthesis of Marxism-Leninism is not identical with classical Marxism. Marxism-Leninism, the notion of socialism in one country, the Popular Front strategy, the two tactics, etc., all reflect an increasingly national awareness of the context of class struggle. This is not a regress into narrow nationalism, as the Trotskyists claim, but rather an increasingly advanced awareness of the real concrete determination and form of class struggle. The internationalism of the Social Democrats, and even of the First International, was, however correct in principle, comparatively a type of indeterminate abstraction, and therefore less advanced than the Marxist-Leninist outlook. No, he actually explicitly says that the revolutions take from the future, not the present. Pure pedantry. Obviously, Marx believed that the future acquires an eminent significance in the present. The present, after all, is in motion. But you missed the actual point. He was not talking about the extent of continuity with history. He was talking about directly attempting to emulate the past. The continuity of what with what. Why should we care about historical continuity? Sure, let me provide you with more education on the matter. The communist outlook regards all world history as a single concrete whole, characterized by a fundamentally rational development. The bourgeois, metaphysical, and idealistic outlook, marked by the narrow terms of the division of labor, regards various eras of history, and moreover, the various details of these eras, only in isolation, and as fundamentally disconnected from both the present and any greater ongoing development, past or present. Dimitrov stresses the importance of history because giving expression to it establishes the context of a single shared historical existence. This gives legitimacy to communists who prove they are truly the leaders of the people, of the nation, at the fundamental level of their historically constituted existence. Now, where is Heidegger? Dimitrov is right. Fascist ideology is 100% rooted in historical continuity, which is precisely how you sneak fascist ideology into Marxism. Lol. The dishonesty is so incredible. I clearly showed that Dimitrov believed that communists must themselves make use of history, or else the fascists will. He says, if we do not root ourselves in historical continuity, the fascists will steal history from us and from the people. This is why you had to elsewhere argue that Dimitrov was wrong. You now take a sentence from Dimitrov out of context, so as to insinuate that he was saying that the problem with fascism is that it draws from history in general, and not the fact that it is drawing from history in such a way so as to legitimize their present villainy. Why would you do this when just a few paragraphs later, what Dimitrov says directly disproves your silly interpretation of that sentence? I mean, kind of like what you do with your transphobia, homophobia. What? What does sexuality have to do with national sentiments? But to be clear, according to Dimitrov's reasoning here, you are in fact playing into the hands of fascists by engaging in national nihilism, confirming their attempts to associate communists with all that is offensive and degrading to national sentiments. Again, sounds like you. Profound argument. Again, shows that historical continuity is an aspect of fascism.
Hundreds of
Again, let us
books are
actually
being
consult what
published in
Dimitrov
Germany with
says.
only one aim: to falsify the history of the German people and give it a fascist complexion. The new baked National Socialist historians try to depict the history of Germany as if for the past 2,000 years, by virtue of some historical law, a certain line of development had run through it like a red thread, leading to the appearance on the historical scene of a national savior, a messiah of the German people, a certain corporal of Austrian extraction. In these books, the greatest figures of the German people of the past are represented as having been fascists, while the great peasant movements are set down as the direct precursors of the fascist movement. Mussolini does his utmost to make capital for himself out of the heroic figure of Garibaldi. The French fascists bring to the fore as their heroine Joan of Arc. The American fascists appeal to the traditions of the American War of Independence, the traditions of Washington and Lincoln. The Bulgarian fascists made the national liberation movement of the 70s and its heroes beloved by the people: Vasil Levski, Stefan Karaj, and others. Communists who suppose that all this has nothing to do with the cause of the working class, who do nothing to enlighten the masses on the past of their people in a historically correct fashion, in a genuinely Marxist-Leninist spirit, who do nothing to link up the present struggle with the people's revolutionary traditions and past, voluntarily hand over to the fascist falsifiers all that is valuable in the historical past of the nation, so that the fascists may fool the masses.
I want to highlight the fact that Dimitrov is not saying the fascists are engaging in any real historical continuity. He is accusing them of the opposite, of falsifying history, and thereby actually deceiving the masses. Genuine continuity, as you can read clearly here, is actually very important for communists. Are you blind, Colin? Let me literally quote it again so you can see. Communists who suppose that all this has nothing to do with the cause of the working class, who do nothing to enlighten the masses on the past of their people, in a historically correct fashion, in a genuinely Marxist-Leninist spirit, who do nothing to link up the present struggle with the people's revolutionary traditions and past, voluntarily hand over to the fascist falsifiers all that is valuable in the historical past of the nation, so that the fascists may fool the masses. Clearly, Dimitrov is emphasizing that historical continuity is important for communists. I genuinely am baffled at your attempts to deny what everyone can read plainly with their own eyes. It just reveals the sad and pathetic extent of your dishonesty. Quote, second, Has says that socialist movements should have heroes, but he fails to specify who should be chosen as heroes. Again, your illiteracy is baffling. Communist states actually did exist, Colin, you fucking moron, including Bulgaria, Dimitrov's own native country. They depicted nearly all great national figures from their respective histories in a heroic fashion. Statues and monuments were built to them. Literature, movies, poetry, etc. was made about them. Anyone with an even elementary degree of familiarity with communist history knows this. Colin says, quote, furthermore, Dimitrov says a historically correct fashion, which does not mean falsifying the history so that slave-owning members of the ruling class like Washington and Jefferson. But, Colin, Dimitrov mentioned Washington directly as an example of a figure communists should not allow the fascists to appropriate. It was one of the examples he listed of the fascist falsification of history. This is further backed by the evidence given by the Communist Party USA at the time. Now, if you would like to present some new historical argument against this, that's fine, but the burden is on you to prove it. You cannot call us fascists for maintaining the same position that was the norm for nearly all American communists throughout history. You deny nations are materially real. You thereby repudiate any pretense to Marxism-Leninism. If you do not believe nations have any material existence, you are not only not a Marxist-Leninist, you are not even a Marxist, but an idealist. Stalin wrote lucidly, quote, a nation is a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup, manifested in a common culture, unquote. There was never a question about the material reality of nations within Marxism, only about the extent to which they would continue to exist separately after a victorious proletarian revolution. To say that nations are not materially real implies that they are purely ideas or thoughts. By admitting you believe this, you have departed from Marxism and entered a bizarre form of solipsistic idealism. You say not an ethnic identity regarding the new Soviet man. To be clear, the argument was that the new Soviet man represented an attempt to progressively facilitate the development of various Soviet ethnic identities such that they would be characterized by their situation within a new national and collective solidarity that exposed them to a far greater degree of diversity of culture, history, etc. You say, I advocate for the progressive development of all people who can learn from all of history. That is very generous of you, Professor. Unfortunately, such grandstanding is devoid of any material or concrete substance. You say, nobody wants to erase histories. We want to destroy the superstitions you want to mobilize. That you regard culture, history, and civilization to be superstitions rather speaks for itself. I doubt even Sterner, your true teacher it seems, would embarrass themselves by making such stupid statements. In any case, without understanding the need to recognize various different histories, without the need to carefully facilitate their exchange and merging together, you regress into the national nihilistic bourgeois cosmopolitanism, which indeed does erase people's cultures and histories, failing to establish any rational continuity between them and the present. Colin says, the biggest threat to your traditionalist perversion of Marxism is history. It has been shown quite clearly that the biggest threat to your own outlook is literacy itself.
Here is Colin's fourth response. The Marxist position on immigration is that we need to incorporate the fight for undocumented workers into the broader working class struggle. Only through the combined efforts of undocumented workers and the rest of the working class can we improve the lives of all workers. Undocumented labor is a priority, especially for a party that emphasizes the role of the commodity-producing portions of the proletariat. Since undocumented labor represents a giant portion of the domestic agriculture industry. Moreover, we should be providing an advanced analysis of how undocumented laborers are being exploited, how border policy brings about a precarious situation for these workers, how this precarity increases the rate of surplus value extraction, and how the entire working class benefits from the emancipation of undocumented workers. If we are arguing about the border policies of a party that has seized power, then we have to distinguish between the policies that are immediately implemented and the policies that would be desirable. Regarding immediate policies, these questions depend on the material conditions, external threats, etc. Yet these immediate policies would simply be stepping stones towards the policies that would be desirable. Since we are talking about the US, which is the global hegemon, there's no way to predict what those material conditions would be. So we should focus on what border policies would be desirable in the absence of external threats, espionage, war, etc. You cannot pre-plan these things. Why would we agitate for positions that contradict what would be desirable for a socialist state? The point is to go ahead of the masses. Has claims that I am ignorant of the basic history of communist organization and what was standard for the late 19th century social democrats. Notice the rhetorical framing. Has claims I am ignorant, yet he does not say what I am ignoring. Has does not say, you are ignoring this specific aspect of the history of these orgs, namely XYZ, which provides support for my position. So Haz's vague reference to the history of these movements provides no support for his claim. Now Haz falls into a nest of thoughtless contradictions. He says that advocating for policies isn't about passing the policies, but creating the context for building a movement. He then claims that I position myself as a wise policymaker, yet Haz began this entire discussion by describing a purely hypothetical scenario where the working class seizes political power in the US and presenting his wise policies for such a scenario. He then goes on to claim that I have no plan for how to make this popular among the masses, which is irrelevant to our discussion. Our discussion is about the correct position on immigration, not about how to develop a general consciousness of this position. Let's move to Haz's response to the fallacious reasoning I pointed out in his previous post. For review, Haz's implicit argument is: Premise 1, no AES country had open borders. Premise 2, the U.S. should only adopt the border policies of AES countries. Therefore, conclusion, the U.S. should adopt a closed border policy. Haz claimed that the USSR managed the flow of its internal ethnic groups because of inherent ethnic tensions. I claimed that these policies, whether right or wrong, were caused by the external threat of counter-revolution. If there were no external threat of invasion sabotage, these policies would not have been implemented. Again, I am not saying that every single decision here was correct or that every story told about this is true. We would have to examine the history closely. Yet now Haz makes another strange inference. And because you claimed that imperialist intrigue was the sole cause of border policies, this must mean that tensions were primarily the consequence of imperialist intrigue. Haz presents a straw person version of my argument. Haz claimed imperialist intrigue was not the sole cause. Haz thinks that I am disputing this claim and am therefore committed to the opposite view that imperialist intrigue was the sole cause. In fact, I claimed, even if the tensions pre-exist, and they did, the fact that there were pre-existing ethnic tensions does not imply that the USSR would have engaged in these border policies even without the threat of imperialism. I claimed, in other words, that Haz is unable to establish that ethnic tensions could be a sufficient cause. Haz is quite right that imperialist intrigue was not the sole cause of these tensions. Not because he understands what he is talking about, but because historical events do not have singular causes, as Hegel pointed out long ago. Everything is determined by an entire network of causes. When we understand historical agency, however, we need to look at the aims that bring these many factors together into a single purpose. The purpose of any such border policies was to prevent imperialist interference. Even if ethnic tensions pre-existed, they were not a sufficient cause. Yet Haz has the audacity to claim that this is basic logic, but really it's just a straw person. Haz then claims that if I carefully study Soviet policies that he has allegedly studied, please, by all means, cite some of the texts you have read, then I will find that there were many times that there were ethnic tensions that lead to social instability, tensions that were prevented by the party. Haz is making an appeal to authority here, basically saying, look, I've studied Soviet policy really well, and this is my opinion based on that. Such arguments are only persuasive to people who already accept Haz as an authority on Soviet history. Since I do not accept that Haz is an authority on Soviet history, he would have to cite examples and documents to prove his position to me, or at least enough to convince me he is an authority on the topic. All of these arguments, of course, have only been mobilized in support of premise 1 of Haz's arguments. None of them address the weakest premise, namely that the U.S. should adopt the same border policies as the Soviet Union. Yet Haz's argument has, in fact, become much weaker in its present form. He actually is claiming, 1, the USSR controlled the internal movement of different ethnic groups at various times. 2, U.S. border policy should be based on the internal policy of the USSR for controlling the flow of ethnic groups. 3, therefore the U.S. should carefully regulate its borders. Haz doesn't like the word segregation as a description of his policy, apparently. If Haz wants to use a different word for separating people based on ethnic differences, go ahead. Haz now claims that Soviets tended to live within historically constituted communities with a common culture, language, and shared historical background. People everywhere tend to live in communities who share similarities, but there are also plenty of people who travel, live in other countries, learn other languages, etc. So what? Well, Haz will now claim that socialism didn't violently uproot people from their communities. Let's suppose, for sake of argument, that this claim is true. Does this support Haz's argument? No. For this, he needs to make the stronger claim that people could not mix together in an uncontrolled way. Let's spell out what Haz is saying. He is claiming that the mixing together of different ethnicities should be controlled. I'm not even in disagreement with the idea that a future society might want to disallow, say, a large group of white settlers to move onto indigenous lands and taking over the community. But we should remember that Haz is prescribing a model for the border policy. not a policy against, say, the gentrification of neighborhoods. Gentrification, Bodayle, has an underlying class dynamic. Of course, and he's going to rant and rave about this, Has is really just putting forth the fourth political theory here. What's hilarious, though, is that Mr. I hate liberals Has is basically describing liberal multiculturalism, which is what Dugin is inverting anyways. So yeah, Has's position is basically just liberalism rooted in cultural essentialism. I say, fuck cultural essentialism and fuck ethnocentrism. My allegiance is to the working class and the dignity and liberation of all people. More or less everything Has is saying about travel restrictions is highly exaggerated or is focusing on specific wartime efforts. Traveling within the USSR was no different than traveling within the European Union. Sure, you couldn't just move into a new city without having a job lined up there, but you have to fill out paperwork to change your residency in every country. Has is calling me a liberal because I use the word segregation to describe his policies. The policy he desires is people could not mix together in an uncontrolled way. And by people here, he means ethnicities. And by uncontrolled, he means a way that uproots people from their historically constituted communities. If he is bothered by the word segregation, he can call it mandatory ethnic separation. However, separation is usually understood by figures in the Black radical tradition to mean by choice. I would like to remind everyone that Has's entire argument rests on the very questionable premise that the U.S. should base its border policy on the Soviet Union's internal policy, as well as Has's questionable claims about movement within the Soviet Union. Has maintains that movement within the Soviet Union was restricted based on ethnic considerations, yet clearly travel was not restricted, and he needs to provide evidence that internal relocation was also restricted based on ethnicity. Even if he does provide evidence of such restrictions, however, this has nothing to do with his main argument, because he cannot prove his underlying assumption that socialism in the U.S. should adopt the USSR's border policies. Now, Has would like to clarify that he simply advocates border control and management. My position is that these policies depend on the material conditions, yet socialism obviously moves in the direction of a greater degree of openness between borders, the disappearance of ethnic tensions and identities, and a greater degree of international solidarity. We should be clear. Open borders does not mean open immigration. Open borders means the freedom to travel across borders, not the freedom to move wherever you want. Has fails to make this distinction. A developed socialist society, being a society of abundance, would not need to restrict travel for economic reasons. But Has gives a second reason: potential cultural misunderstandings. So Has is saying that he wishes to prevent people, based on their ethnicity or culture, from traveling across borders. What cultures or ethnicities does Has want to keep out of the U.S.? He never specifies. What's really strange about Duginism, rant all you want, but you know, and I know what this is that Dugin makes this hard commitment to cultural essentialism, as if there weren't differences between individuals. Call me a lib, you multiculturalist, I dare you. Or if people didn't have a choice when it comes to identifying with their historically constituted community. We should treat individuals as individuals, some of whom might identify as members of a historically constituted community, which is their choice, or bring various elements of their shared collective knowledge and experience with them, and others who might reject such cultural identities despite this history. Has's cultural essentialism is a superstition. Has can adopt any content he wants into it. This is because all humans are free to create a historical narrative for themselves, to identify with whatever historical tradition or community they want, even if those communities do not accept them. These are just ideas and the experiences and knowledge we have from being around certain groups of people with shared values. Yet people often make up bogus cultural identities or historical continuities because these are fundamentally ideologies. They are products of thought and experience. They are not real. How can people who speak different languages understand each other? Ich weiß nicht Mutterficker. Vielleicht sie eine andere Sprache lernen können. Yet Has does not want the party to be a translator. He's really suggesting, based on the context of our discussion, travel restrictions for people who don't speak English. That doesn't sound like being a translator, more like being a dick. If we recognize people on a collective basis, it is through their membership in the universal category of proletariat and universal human dignity, not through their particular cultural identity. Haas is not committed to Marxism. He is committed to identity politics. If we recognize people on a particular basis, it is through recognizing that their particular struggle is a form of class struggle, and seeking to unite these many class struggles against exploitation and oppression into a single movement. These silly word games, where Haas quotes Dimitrov's description of the fascist view of history, which he endorses, and then uses this to claim that Marxists should also draw upon fascistic notions of history. This sleight of hand is amusing, but too unserious to warrant a response. Haas talks about literacy, but really this is just you saying, "I'm right because Dimitrov says so." This is a childish appeal to authority. What interests me is whether Dimitrov was correct, whether he gives good reasons for his views, and whether they have any bearing on our actions today. I will conclude by shaming Haas for not understanding what materialism means. He quotes the following text: "A nation is a historically constituted, stable community of people, formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture." Haas claims that this statement proves that nations are materially real. Yet JS didn't say that in the quote, did he? If we examine each of the features of a nation listed in this quote, we find that some of them are material and some of them are ideal. First, nations are historically constituted, meaning they existed in the past, and they are a stable community of people. That is, people living together. What are the features that make such a group a nation? Let's see. 1. A common language. A language is composed of signs and meanings. Signs are material, but meanings are products of the brain. Words mean nothing unless they are understood within consciousness. So language has a material base, signs and brains, but is not purely material. 2. Territory. Borders do not actually exist, but are established by laws or custom and protected by force. All of this is influenced by material conditions, but territory is superstructural. 3. Economic life. This is the material basis, the mode of production and relations of production that bind these people together. So material. 4. Psychological makeup. Obviously, this is all ideal, not material. 5. Manifested in a common culture. So then, the material and ideal components manifest themselves in the form of a common culture, which is itself ideal insofar as it refers to how a people conceive of themselves based on the material and ideal elements. Nations are not material entities, although they have material components. They are superstructural, yet have a basis in real things, like the mode of production and relations of production, the historical fact that people have lived together in the same area, but also based on lots of ideal components, like whether they can understand each other and ideological elements like religion, values, myths, stories, etc. Superstructural elements, like nations, can be useful for forming coalitions in national liberation struggles because they can bring people together under a common purpose. Just because something is superstructural or ideal doesn't mean it should be erased or that it is irrelevant. Marxist theory is a set of ideas in the brain. Proletarian consciousness is a set of ideas. The question is, do these ideas help the exploited and oppressed in their struggle for liberation? Haas's goal, however, is not liberating the oppressed and exploited. His project is one of identity politics based in cultural essentialism. The biggest threat to his project is cosmopolitanism, or globalism. He wants borders controlled, not because he has in mind the liberation of the oppressed and exploited, but because he wants to dig up cultural identities and historical myths from the dustbin of history.
My fourth takedown of Colin. You once again demonstrate your inability to follow the basic line of argumentation at hand regarding the question of the difference between current U.S. border policy and whatever strategic significance changes in it might have for communists not in power, communist border policy, and what policies a movement should agitate for here and now. The actual and original argument you attempted to provide for open borders was not that it would be favorable for a ruling communist party or a proletarian dictatorship, but for the workers' movement in general. You claimed that if all immigration was immediately legalized, this would eliminate the enslavement of migrant labor and thereby negate the harmful effect mass immigration has on the domestic power of labor. This extremely stupid claim neglects the basic facts of the international labor market, the fact that some workers are actually willing to work for less due to the unevenness of global costs of labor, and that there is actually no way to, outside of power, enforce uniform labor standards without those themselves being circumvented. But never mind this, because it's actually besides the point. What you ignored is that it put the cart before the horse. Migrants do not have anywhere near the leverage that domestic workers have as far as their ability to organize. If you were to pass a policy on the basis of the reasoning that it would benefit the workers' movement, then short of some kind of Machiavellian 4D chess and complete subterfuge of U.S. politics for the utilitarian aim of legalizing all immigration, though it is curious, if you have such power, why not use it to just dismantle the state outright rather than one policy? You would already need a strong labor movement in the first place that advocates for policies that are, supposedly, and this one in particular is just according to your stupid ass, in its interests. You would need to build a strong core movement of domestic workers in the first place before even thinking about organizing migrant workers. And the reason for that is simple. Absent a core movement based in the domestic working class, migrant workers have absolutely no leverage. The dependency capitalists have upon their slave labor only rests upon the very conditions you'd be organizing them to abolish. Logically, to whatever extent they could ever be successful is the same extent to which whatever leverage they had in the first place disappears. This is why you cannot take a shortcut around the actual national domestic working class. They alone have the leverage to challenge the ruling class, because deporting them would be a violation of the entire state itself, not just them as workers, but as citizens. The whole edifice of the state itself would collapse. You just fail to understand that policies do not come out of the heads of brilliant, or even comically stupid ones, like yourself, individuals. They, to the extent that they are outside the intentions of the ruling class, rest on the basis of movements. Power can only be exercised outside of the established power, through the power of masses, movements, large volumes of people willing to fight. In this way, you put the cart before the horse. You think that this policy will benefit the labor movement, or labor in general, but being able to pass it and go against the current policy of slavery would itself require the very same degree of power by the labor movement which you presume such a policy would establish. At the very minimum, you would need a huge degree of popular support. Perhaps Colin thinks he is going to be able to mobilize and pull upon the heartstrings of all of America's college students, fomenting a mass movement on the basis of passing new immigration policy to legalize all immigration. But if you had the power to foment any mass movement whatsoever, for any purpose whatsoever, you wouldn't need to be bitching about the American Communist Party on Twitter 24/7. So it begs the question, why haven't you gone about putting your theory into practice yourself? This is why I claim you are fundamentally ignorant of the basic history of socialist and communist politics, organizing, and movements. You claim I'm not providing any specific examples, but I very clearly stated that socialist parties and movements have always distinguished the content of agitation from the content of the responsibilities of actual administration once they actually were to seize power. Agitation in the realm of policy advocation serves the purpose of heightening contradictions and educating the masses about them. It serves the purpose of exposing why the bourgeois state is incapable of acquiescing to basic minimal demands. This basic taking into account of the disparity between the consciousness of communists and that of the masses was elaborated masterfully by Lenin in Left-Wing Infantilism, a book whose contents you are being exposed to for the first time in your sad life. Reproaching those German ultra-lefts who regarded parliamentary institutions as altogether outmoded, Lenin states, quote, "Parliamentarism is of course politically obsolete to the communists in Germany, but, and that is the whole point, We must not regard what is obsolete to us as something obsolete to a class, to the masses." Unquote. The specific content of what communists do in Parliament is not to fall under the illusion that this is actually an organ of proletarian policymaking. The content is to serve the purpose of agitation and educating the masses through the course of the contradictions that are revealed in the struggle therein. Such is made clear by Lenin when it comes to participation in parliaments altogether. Before Lenin, the precedent set by the Second International was also very clear. The 1891 Erfurt program of the German Social Democratic Party established clearly the distinction between maximal and minimal programs. Before the era of reformism, Social Democrats did not regard minimal programs as a vehicle to serve any kind of humane purpose. They regarded minimal programs as agitational vehicles to realize mass movements that would eventually be powerful enough to realize the maximal program, the program of victorious social democracy at the reins of power. This set a basic precedent for communist parties in conditions where there was no expectation of an imminent revolutionary situation. The fact you were unaware of these basic facts and required me to list specific examples of them, etc., reveals that you're just receiving a free education at this point, not engaging in an actual debate. You then claim I have fallen into a nest of thoughtless contradictions. The reasoning you provide for this is that, in fact, it is I who is presenting myself as the wise policymaker by giving people an idea of what a communist party might do if it actually seized power. But you missed the point of why I accused you of this. You are actually trying to pass policies under the current regime to serve the purpose of strengthening the labor movement. This is the reasoning you provided for telling communists to agitate for open borders and legalizing all immigration. But passing those policies in the first place requires making them popular among the masses. This is the objective fact of the matter. You are attempting to be a wise policymaker who benefits the masses without any mediation by an actual mass movement, which is what you would actually need for any policy to be passed under the current system in the first place. By contrast, the program of a communist party is not made under the illusion that any policy in the present state is going to be passed for the utilitarian purpose of benefiting the movement. It is the open program of the party that is given to the masses, and the extent to which it resonates among them is a basic question of the dialectical process by which the masses and a communist party learn from each other. But you are trying to manage some kind of labor movement before it even exists as a wise policymaker, passing policies that benevolently help the workers. You claim that the decisive step of making the policy popular among the masses is irrelevant. But if the very condition of the possibility of what you propose rests upon it, in actual material reality, mind you, how is it irrelevant? Under what circumstances would it be possible for this policy to be passed without being led by a core mass movement? You reveal your individualism and idealism by treating policies in a vacuum, divorced from the actual material and social conditions under which they would even be possible. You claim these conditions are irrelevant, only the correctness or incorrectness of the policy matters. But as we can see, such a criterion of correctness or incorrectness, by your own admission, has to be expunged from basic material and social considerations. How could such a criterion possibly reflect the materialist outlook? Or do you, like your teachers, regard the reality of masses, politics, social relationships, etc., as immaterial realities? Do you regard as material only what is possible within the narrow sphere of hypothetical, natural scientific possibility, expunged of any human element? Then your materialism lacks dialectics and is certainly not Marxist. What kind of Marxist can derive the correctness or incorrectness of not only a policy, but a given viewpoint, in a way unmediated by material considerations? Not a Marxist at all, but a bourgeois idealist. Now, sensing that you have gotten yourself in a difficult position, you attempt to combine two entirely separate positions you have espoused, namely, one, the policy of open borders you propose here and now under the current regime on the supposed basis that it would help the workers' movement, and two, a hypothetical policy of open borders as the program of a communist party that has seized power. By conflating these two, You downplayed the immediate significance of actually having to make policy one popular among the masses. You now afford yourself the liberty of simply treating it as policy two. But now you have no argument in favor of open borders at all, especially while you lack any precedent by any communist state in history. We all saw your syllogism. I was hoping you would bring it up in this post of yours, because I began to worry that since I did not respond to that tweet, you were holding on to it as the last refuge of delusion, that you could somehow avoid the total, complete, and unequivocal destruction I am going to dispense upon you. It is only appropriate to force a given line of reasoning under the scrutiny of formal logic when an otherwise ordinary use of reasoning must be called into question. You have to demonstrate why that is, though. Absent the ability to confront the actual facts, you attempt to engage in sophistry by litigating the formal correctness of the reasoning I engaged in. But no such formal parameters that satisfy the limited confines of propositional logic were ever even agreed upon. The basic error of attempting to impose them here is that it unjustifiably reduces, in bad faith, the terms involved in the ordinary use of reasoning to rigid and exclusionary variables. I did not simply claim that just because no actually existing AES country had open borders, the United States likewise shouldn't. In order to demonstrate the validity of your syllogism, you need to show how I established this just because. You cannot. I didn't simply mention the border policies of past and present AES states and use the authority of the latter to justify them. I mentioned them to illustrate examples of the actually applied communist outlook on the question of immigration, borders, and national policy, and I moreover provided an ample amount of explanation and reasoning for these policies. In other words, I did not only provide examples, I showed how they were rationally commensurate with the underlying logic, method, etc. behind the communist outlook. Therefore, your syllogism collapses as a supposed illustration of my argument. I demonstrated this under multiple lenses: questions of not only security, but basic socialist economic planning, questions of national policy, and questions of mediating, balancing, and reducing tensions between different historically constituted groups. You ignored all of these facts of history. You made no argument about why none of this would apply to a proletarian dictatorship in America. Let me help you, Colin. If you were smart, you would say that the rigid form of socialist planning in past AES won't be applicable in the 21st century, and that these were necessary to build socialism in feudal or semi-feudal conditions, and were therefore far more restrictive conditions than in a modern liberal society. In those conditions, people were weighed down by past prejudices to a far greater degree. This is not a particularly brilliant point, but it is the bare minimum to prove your sapience. I would, of course, respond by pointing out the example of China, a country which has indeed moved beyond the primary stage of socialism and into a far more dynamic system. I would point out that despite this, planning was never actually liberalized, just made more dynamic. I would point out the extensive system of restrictions on internal migration within China. I would point out how still all forms of mass migration in China are planned and controlled, whether on an ethnic basis or otherwise. This is the basic meaning of socialist responsibility, and treating the realities of populations on a collective rather than individual basis. The free-for-all of liberal individualism cannot survive into a proletarian dictatorship. It negates the very logic of the proletarian dictatorship, which is a type of state power that addresses society at the level of collective existences and operates on that basis. You then start floundering as a consequence of your own inability to follow a basic line of argumentation. You hilariously tried to claim that imperialist intrigue was basically the sole cause of border policy. I mentioned the counterexample of ethnic tensions and the mitigation of them thereof. You then said that these ethnic tensions, at least to the extent that they factored into consideration for migration and national policy, logically must themselves be the consequence of imperialist intrigue. You deny this now. But here is what you said directly. Every instance of immigration being tightly controlled under AES was a result of socialism being under siege, including incidents that aim to prevent ethnic conflicts, a tool that NATO frequently uses to destabilize governments. So you claim that incidents that aim to prevent ethnic conflicts were a consequence of responding to imperialist intrigue. For all your floundering and gibbering about syllogisms, logic just isn't your strong suit, is it, Colin? You claim that the point is that mitigating ethnic tensions was never a sufficient cause of restrictive migration or border policies in AES. But you never actually got around to addressing the question of why these same restrictive policies were applied between socialist fraternal states or internally as pertained to national policy. For example, you could not explain the implementation of phenomena like the Soviet Czechoslovak population transfer agreements. In agreements such as these, only ethnic Russians and Ukrainians within Czechoslovakia were given the option to acquire permanent citizenship in the USSR, while Czechs and Slovaks were given the same option for Czechoslovakia. Inside Czechoslovakia, Czechs and Slovaks were not given the same option to move to the USSR. Why was that, Colin? The argument that ethnic considerations were never sufficient causes in explaining Soviet migration and border policies collapses wherever we evaluate changes in the Soviet border, in SSRs like Ukraine, for example. While some scholars argue that restrictive Soviet border practices can be reduced to paranoia that other populations were raised under different systems and governments, this reduction collapses upon minimal scrutiny. When we evaluate the case of the Soviet annexation of Polish territories, where ethnic Ukrainians resided who had lived for nearly 2 decades outside the Soviet system, the Soviets were in no way reluctant or hesitant to grant the latter full citizenship in the Ukrainian SSR. Many cases exist of population transfers, such as the Soviet-Czech agreement mentioned above. In an agreement with the new Polish government in the post-war period, ethnic Poles were transferred out of Western Ukraine and into Poland. Why didn't the Soviet Union treat such realities as a liberal free-for-all? Because they knew that without carefully defined agreements between different nations that treated populations on a collective rather than individual basis, red lines could inevitably be crossed which offend people's national honor. In this way, they reduced ethnic tensions, animosity, and conflicts. All the examples we see of mass migration, of huge volumes of people moving around, were tightly controlled, regulated, and national considerations were taken strongly into account. It would be hardly reasonable to justify the notion that all of this happened strictly on the basis of imperialist intrigue. If that were true, the Soviets should have been far more reluctant in gleefully accepting ethnic Russians and Ukrainians who resided in Czechoslovak territory, while tightly restricting entry for other populations. You claim I do not have the authority to talk about Soviet history. I invite you to study the history of the USSR's national policy. Ethnic tensions were mitigated by institutionalizing ethnic identities and delimiting definite territories of settlement, employment, opportunity, etc. for them. It suffices to study the dynamics of Soviet policy when it came to defining SSR, ASSR, autonomous oblast, etc. Statuses for different groups. These and their delimited territories actually underwent considerable degrees of variation, i.e. conversion of SSRs into ASSRs, vice versa, etc., often on the basis of mitigating ethnic tensions. In the Caucasus, the territories of the Armenian and Azeri SSRs had to be carefully delimited so as to mitigate outbreaks of violence and tensions, while stemming all separatist impulses. This is why the Soviet Union did not really have mass migration, as much as it had varying and dynamic delimitations of territory, and these delimitations were themselves very restrictive. They could not be crossed liberally, but they themselves could change depending on different circumstances. The idea of cosmopolitan individuals freely moving around without restriction across territories and borders was inconceivable. Only Western liberals like yourself, Colin, regard that as some human right. You claim that the underlying premise of my argument is, somehow, that the U.S. should adopt the same exact border policies as the Soviet Union. There are many layers of stupidity surrounding this. For one, it doesn't distinguish the present regime from a proletarian dictatorship. In particular, it ignores how border policies obviously varied between past and present communist states. But rather, what they all had in common was an outlook on questions of national policy, flow of population, settlement, and social existence that led to certain shared characteristics, which there is no reason to assume a communist America would not also possess. The logic of proletarian dictatorship and socialist construction necessarily prevents the possibility of free flows of population on an individual basis. Settlement, employment, and various social benefits all need to be carefully controlled for socialist planning to even be possible. In consideration of recognizing differences between different historically constituted groups, it is also necessary that encounters between populations are not left to the devil, as a free-for-all without any mediation. All of these considerations reflect the differences between the communist and the liberal, or the proletarian and the bourgeois outlook. The bourgeois outlook only recognizes individuals. It does not recognize people at the level of their collective existence or social being. And as Marxism-Leninism teaches us, nationality is the form of social existence, the form of a given historically constituted social being. Under liberal policy, people are only treated as individuals. So when huge volumes of people of similar background migrate somewhere, this is treated as just an accident and an amalgamation of different individual snowflakes. No responsibility is assumed for the consequences this might have, whether social, economic, or cultural. The communist view, in relation to such matters, is one of responsibility, not liberalism and irresponsibility. That is my premise. Not that the U.S. should adopt so-and-so policy just because the Soviet Union did. You claim that I'm talking about separating people on the basis of ethnic differences and therefore a policy of segregation. That isn't true at all. I don't want to separate anyone, actually. People are already separated. So the question is, how do you proceed from there? Allow ethnic tensions to explode and lead to ethnic conflicts, or recognize these already existing differences so that any antagonism can be managed. The point is not at all imposing separation, but carefully managing existing forms of separation between people. And the principal form of separation is based on recognizing their national sovereignty. Different historically constituted groups, more often than not, exist within the context of different sovereign states. That is why the Soviets treated the delimitation of Soviet republics, oblasts, okrugs, etc. on such a careful basis. This is why I strongly emphasize controlling immigration on the basis of bilateral agreements. Notice how this outlook that prioritizes the recognition of national sovereignty is basic Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy. Introductory textbooks like the Fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism literally have entire chapters titled Cosmopolitanism and Not Patriotism is the Ideology of the Imperialist Bourgeoisie. It reads clearly, quote, "The question here concerns the ideology encouraged by the imperialists, which propagates a sham obsolescence of the principle of sovereignty, the legitimacy of limiting state independence, and indifference to national traditions and contempt for national culture. This ideology alleges that at the present time the idea of motherland is devoid of any meaning. For the financial oligarchy of the USA, cosmopolitanism has proved the best way of disguising its struggle for world supremacy and for the doing away with the independence of other states." Unquote. You go on to ignore the significance of what was the norm in the Soviet Union, claiming that people tend to live in communities everywhere and that people also travel. But under capitalism, people are not only uprooted from their communities, they are fundamentally alienated from them in ways they were not in the Soviet Union, which preserved their collective historical existence in ways capitalist countries did not for their own populations. And you ignore how severely travel, let alone permanent settlement, was restricted in the USSR, even internally. And yes, to whatever extent different people mixed together, it was definitely controlled. This is a fact of Soviet history. You attempt to racialize this in the context of America. But if you knew anything about the actual viewpoint of the American Communist Party on the national question in America, which you regularly decry as racist and fascist, you would know that we do not recognize different races as separate nations. We recognize only one American nation and the various histories of different races as belonging to a single, integral history of one nation in the process of defining itself. Marxism-Leninism recognizes national policy as inexorably tied to the basic questions of self-determination and sovereignty. Once again, Here lies the significance of bilateral agreements in consideration of immigration under socialism. You then claim, in all your generosity, that you do not want settlers to randomly move into indigenous lands and oppose gentrification. But you miss the point entirely. The point is not about establishing discriminatory policies against certain ethnicities or groups in consideration of mass migration. Your fundamentally liberal error resides in the assumption that mass migration is the norm rather than the exception. In the strict sense that people are moving around for no reason whatsoever, and there is no way to make that reason accountable to an actual socialist country, which is somehow, mind you, managing and being accountable for nearly every other factor and consideration of production. Under socialism, the movement of peoples must obey a social and collective rationale rather than the whims of an individual. People cannot simply freely decide, in an individual capacity, to move anywhere they want to without some kind of accountability for the consequences of this decision being taken into consideration. It is true that socialism should at the least be as dynamic as current American capitalism is when it comes to permitting people the freedom to choose their fate. But this does not mean being blind to consequences. Under liberalism, is it true that people can simply move wherever they want? No. They must be attuned to basic economic considerations, such as the prospects for employment, settlement, and others. And only when these matters are settled can individual whim, taste, and discretion acquire true power. But under socialism, by no means are these matters settled automatically. That would be utopian. They are still economic considerations that need to be factored in a way that is commensurate with socialist planning. Socialism will not eliminate all economic restrictions whatsoever. It will rather base those restrictions in the rational necessity of economic planning rather than the irrational and anarchic realities of capitalism. This requires treating individuals on a level that is more collective than under the present liberal capitalist system. Now, for whatever bizarre reason, you claim that this basic truism of not only the experience of all socialist economics, including today's China, but from what anyone can see, would follow quite logically and inevitably from the realities of a proletarian dictatorship and socialist planning, is somehow liberalism. You go on to claim that what is being described here, which is just educating you about the actual realities of AES, including the Soviet Union, is just putting forth the fourth political theory. Not content with embarrassing yourself here to such an unfathomably ridiculous extent, you quickly realize how you have contradicted yourself, floundering around in your own accredited excrement, and eventually deciding to fall upon the proposition that actually I am inverting Dugin. And not a sentence after accusing me of being a liberal, this is what illiberal Colin says, quote, I say F cultural essentialism and F ethnocentrism. My allegiance is to the working class and the dignity and liberation of all people. Very punk rock. Very brave. Unfortunately, this is little more than an infantile type of idealist cosmopolitanism, which has nothing to do with the Marxist-Leninist tradition. What you are effectively saying is that cultures and nations don't matter. Rather, what matters is some indeterminate and ideal abstraction in your head. True proletarian internationalism is derived on the basis of the recognition of different nations. It is universality through particularity, universality through movements within concrete determinations. As the quote, liberal Duginist Fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism points out, quote, bourgeois propaganda tries to represent the capitalist class as the bearer of patriotic feelings. They want to slur over the fact that the patriotism of the bourgeoisie is always subordinate to its selfish, narrow class interests, and to disparage the patriotism of the working class and communists. In this connection, bourgeois propagandists sometimes refer to the passage in the Communist Manifesto which says that the working men have no country. It is perfectly clear, however, that it is not a question of repudiating the fatherland, but of the fact that in a society ruled by capitalists, the fatherland is actually usurped by exploiters and is not a good father, but a vicious stepfather to the workers. By overthrowing the rule of the exploiting classes, the working class creates the conditions for the fullest possible manifestation of its patriotism, for it itself is the true bearer of patriotism in our time. Developing the Marxist point of view regarding the fatherland, Lenin wrote in 1908, "The fatherland, i.e., the given political, cultural, and social environment, is the most powerful factor in the class struggle of the proletariat. The proletariat cannot be indifferent to and unconcerned about the political, social, and cultural conditions of its struggle, and consequently cannot remain indifferent to the fate of its country. This does not in any way mean, however, that, while belonging to the single international army of working people, the worker ceases to be a Frenchman, Englishman, Italian, etc. Quite the contrary. True and not sham patriotism springs naturally from proletarian internationalism. In point of fact, does not faithfulness to the ultimate ideal of the working class imbue the workers with a fervent desire to see their own people free, prosperous, and achieving social progress? Seeking liberation from all forms of oppression and exploitation, the working class wants this not only for itself, but also for all the working people, for the whole nation. Only the achievement of the ultimate aims of the working class, i.e., the overthrow of the power of the exploiters, who impede the progress of the nation and the building of socialism, can bring every nation real freedom, independence, and national greatness. It follows that the most internationalist class, the working class, is at the same time the most patriotic class." Unquote. Compare this lucid outlook based in Marxism-Leninism with your own childish F culture. You actual child, you go on to make the hilarious and delusional claim that, quote, traveling within the USSR was no different than traveling within the European Union. Sure, you couldn't just move into a new city without having a job lined up there, but you have to fill out paperwork to change your residency in every country. Unquote. Ha ha ha. The Soviets had one of the most restrictive internal migration systems in the entire world. This passport, Propiska-based system, those who received a Propiska, which was initially designated only for certain regions, they were authorized to reside in a certain address or area. But changing this area was not a right, and without special permission or some special reason, it was very difficult. Notice, this is true even just for individuals, to say nothing of entire swaths of populations. Now, even if it were true for individuals that it was easy to resettle, which it was not, as I will show, and no different than the European Union, one of the primary differences you're ignoring is that this isn't the same as mass migration. As soon as these, quote, whimsical choices by individuals would ever acquire the ineligibility of a social pattern, the idea the Soviet state would not be responsive to this phenomena in a decisive way is just hilarious. I just implore anyone reading this to study literally anything about the internal system of migration in the Soviet Union to see how fucking stupid Colin sounds to me right now. The Soviets had a three-part system of passport control. A countryside that did not even rally have passports, thus couldn't move anywhere else unless as a direct consequence of state policy. Unrestricted cities, where any passport holder could hypothetically reside, i.e. with no outstanding restrictions preempting it formally, that doesn't mean they could do it whimsically or just choose to. And closed cities, where passport holders could reside only with special permission. So there is variance within the system. Again, nothing that reaches the proportion of liberal capitalism, but nonetheless, variance. That is because the system is controlled with an actual rational purpose and plan in mind. It is not a liberal free-for-all. You are trying to create a straw man, according to which I am arguing that no travel, no migration, no flows of population, etc., should ever be allowed, when the reality is that what I am arguing is that it should be controlled according to a rational criterion. Control does not preempt allowing for a limited extent of free movement when the parameters of this movement are predefined and when all its consequences can be properly anticipated and calculated. Once again, you're gibbering about this straw man, according to which I am saying that people should be separated on ethnic lines. I am not saying that. I am saying those lines will exist regardless of whether you recognize them or not, and thus, if not carefully managed, it can lead to undesirable outcomes, including alienating people, both migrants and native residents, from their historically constituted cultures and communities. You are somehow creating the straw man that I fear Colin Bodayle's utopia, where everyone will just mix together in one indiscriminate melting pot, where no ethnic considerations will ever factor into how communities are constituted, where everyone will just be a free individual devoid of any particular collective existence, beyond the abstract universal of all people and all humanity. I do not fear your utopia, Colin. I just think it's an infantile desire which has no basis in reality. The reality is that if you do not carefully manage differences between different historically constituted communities, it will lead to misunderstanding, conflict, chaos, and an explosion of ethnic tensions and resentments. Hypothetically, if we did not have to worry about that, why would I, or Soviet statesmen for that matter, or the statesmen of any communist state in history, care less? Because I am a, quote, racial essentialist. But to prove that, you need to demonstrate how that is fundamental to my reasoning. You can't do that. You haven't done it, and you won't do it. You say travel was not restricted, and he needs to provide evidence that internal relocation was also restricted based on ethnicity. Even if he does provide evidence of such restrictions, however, this has nothing to do with his main argument. Hold on, what? First, the comical delusion. Quote, travel was not restricted. Huh? What do you mean it wasn't restricted? It was the most severely and tightly restrictive travel regime in the history of any large polity in world history. You then claim I need to provide evidence that ethnic identity factored in considerations of restriction. But what about providing evidence for the ludicrous claim that there was no restriction at all? In any case, the Propiska included ethnic identification. Why do you think that was? The Propiska was necessary even for temporary travel, mind you. To list specific examples of restriction based on ethnicity, it was never formalized, obviously. But in terms of how to make sense of the patterns of the decisions made as far as restricting travel from different groups, it's pretty clear, according to all reputable historians, that ethnicity was a significant factor. Depending on patterns and tendencies of migration, the Soviets limited it to some regions and opened it in some others, on the basis of clearly intelligible ethnic and national considerations. It was never really a massive issue, though, because people did not arbitrarily even want to randomly transplant themselves into different ethnic communities. It made no sense. Why would people just want to move away from their families and so on randomly? The logic of snowflake liberalism didn't exist. I want to go on a journey. I guess there was some Russian hippies who had this mentality, but they were regarded as antisocial by the state. You then decade, for some reason, to make a distinction between open borders and open immigration. By this, I assume you are pedantically referring to the distinction between permanent residency or citizenship and moving around freely. Just what are you waffling about, Colin? Quote, Has is saying that he wishes to prevent people, based on their ethnicity or culture, from traveling across borders. I expressly said the opposite. You are dishonest. What I said clearly and succinctly was that such travel should be planned for, controlled, and carefully managed, not unilaterally and unconditionally restricted. Why is this so hard for you to understand? You claim I need to specify the exclusion of certain cultures and ethnicities. Again, you're incapable of thinking in a Marxist fashion. I do not need to specify anything like that. A ruling Communist Party will pose the question, who is trying to immigrate to America, and for what reason? What are the causes and underlying factors behind this? What might be the consequences of this, economically and culturally? How can we ensure that these consequences conform to the goals of socialist planning and proletarian dictatorship? How can we address these causes and underlying factors and render them commensurate on a rational level with their consequences? Firstly, the question would not be treated in a cosmopolitan way. People who want to immigrate are doing so from a certain country. What is the political status of that country? What is their disposition? A bilateral agreement should be in place so both countries can carefully plan and manage the flows and transfers of populations on a rational basis. This is what it means to treat immigration from the perspective of socialist responsibility rather than liberal cosmopolitanism. In contrast to what you ridiculously propose, which is open borders or open immigration, you then start floundering about and revealing your liberal individualism by comparing the differences between different historically constituted groups and the differences between individuals. The reason Marxists reject that comparison is because individual differences have no historical import when abstracted from the integral and wider realities of collective existence based in a definite mode of production and a tangibly, historically constituted community. Individuals are situated within the context of a social being which possesses different forms, and these forms within Marxism-Leninism are called nations. Quote, we should treat individuals as individuals, some of whom might identify as members of a historically constituted community. Okay, Rachel Dolezal. The problem is that these are exceptions to the norm, and the whims of the individual are by no means a sufficient basis for a historically constituted community. To the extent that a historically constituted community accepts an individual from without, it is to the extent that this individual submits to the history of a real, constituted collective existence, and not to the extent that such an existence submits to the whims and desires of some outside individual. The reason this point about individuals choosing to live in different communities is immaterial is because such choices could never serve as the foundation of any community, at least according to Marxism, in the first place. I have no idea why you're bringing up Dugin anyway. He actually does say that people can choose to be Russian, have the Russian soul and outlook, and that it isn't based on blood or genetics. I mean, you keep bringing up Dugin rather than talk about Marxism-Leninism, but what's funny is that you don't even know about Dugin either. Quote, all humans are free to create a historical narrative for themselves, to identify with whatever historical tradition or community they want, even if those communities do not accept them. Unquote, ha, I am superstitious for thinking that you cannot just become a Navajo, even if they reject you at that, because it's what you identify as. This is your idealism. You think history and communities are based on individuals whimsically identifying with things in their head, rather than tangibly grounded patterns of reproduction and production, which are based in material and historical laws. Marx made it clear, men and women do make history, but not as they please. It seems you missed that part. You say these are just ideas and the experiences and knowledge we have from being around certain groups of people with shared values. But experiences and knowledge are not just ideas. They have a profoundly unconscious basis. Studies have even shown that generational trauma can be passed down on an epigenetic basis. Sorry, Colin, but you cannot just decide to be an indigenous American because you feel like it. They are products of thought and experience. They are not real. Yes, Colin, nations are not real. How very Marxist. I recommend reading Engels' Origin, where he outlines the material basis of nations quite clearly. They are very far from just being thoughts and experience. They are integral patterns of reproduction, production, and communal existence in relation to nature. The point about being a translator flew over your head and just decided to take it literally. But even on that account, your argument is that it makes me a dick. It seems I have become yet another thing, in addition to title of professor, you do not have. This is getting quite tiring. You then continue to expose your lack of rudimentary familiarity with Marxism-Leninism, or even just basic dialectics, by claiming that the only collective existence is some abstract universal, like universal human dignity, lol, unmediated by any particular determination. Sigh. Firstly, this is an undialectical logic. An abstract universal lacks concreteness, and within dialectical logic, universality can only be given expression through particular determinations. Further, an abstract universal identity, like universal human dignity, cannot possibly acquire the status of a collective existence. A collective existence cannot be real if it is not tangible or particular. If it is just some kind of intangible, abstract, universal totality within which all individuals belong, it has no particular material significance. We are just back in liberal individualism, because such a category has no concrete or practical import. It may as well not even exist beyond some vague commitment to universal human rights. And that is the logical conclusion of this silly thinking of yours in the end. American unipolar imperialism. What you are talking about is a type of silly, Philistine bourgeois cosmopolitanism that has nothing in common with proletarian internationalism. You accuse the basic Marxist-Leninist outlook of being identical with identity politics. But the opposite is true. Identity politics is founded precisely upon a metaphysics of intangible, abstract universals. These are not concrete particulars, they are particular abstract universals, vessels of the same invariable bourgeois identity of nothingness. They are not living forms of collective existence, they are invariable vessels of pure difference. They are thus devoid of concreteness. True concreteness is based on a dialectic of form and content. Communist universalism acquires substantiality because it is mediated concretely within specific, tangible existences, defined not by invariable forms of identities, but specific instantiations of a universal dialectical tension, such as class struggle. This is why the slogan of Marxism-Leninism on the matter is national in form, socialist in content. Since the time of the Communist Manifesto, Marxists understood that class struggle is national in form. Nations are very real, insofar as they are particular determinations of a contradiction. But the very fact of their particularity is not simply an accident, but commensurate with the ontology of dialectics itself, according to which a universal acquires reality only through its particular instantiations. Nay, it is the same as those instantiations, it shares identity with them. This is what preempts the possibility of identity politics or bourgeois nationalism, because we cannot know the universal according to the conceit of an invariable thought or identity. We can give form to the contradiction only actively, by participating in the living historical development of a given nation. When Soviet Russians gave expression to the Russian national form, such as in socialist realism, they were not giving expression to an invariable idea. They were giving expression through particular forms of activity, artistic, literary, or even political, to a living contradiction and a living movement, namely the historical development of socialist construction within the Russian context. This could never be reduced to some pure idea. It was an active process, rooted in constant change. You cannot see the difference between this and identity politics, because you simply don't know anything about Marxism. It's really that simple. On the question of Dimitrov, thanks for conceding. I was wondering how long that would take. You don't agree with Dimitrov, fine, but let's not deceive people and pretend my position here is anything other than standard Marxism-Leninism. You then hilariously attempt to imply that Stalin did not mean to say nations were materially real when he claimed that they were a, quote, historically constituted, stable community of people, formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, do my eyes deceive me? Colin claims that what Stalin describes above is not necessarily something he would regard as materially real. You claim that language is not purely material because of the needed materiality of consciousness. At best, this makes you guilty of metaphysical dualism, which actually means the worst thing, idealism. Consciousness is not somehow immaterial. It is definitely a material reality. It is just not material according to the direct products of consciousness itself. In other words, idealism is not the product of some metaphysically ideal realm, but of a confusion, of a misrecognition, a vain attempt to regard all reality as identical with a given product of thought activity, hypothetical or otherwise. Idealism itself is a material reality. Marx regards it as a consequence of the division of labor in his early writings. Everything has a material basis in reality according to materialism, Colin. You claim territory is immaterial, but neglect how Stalin makes it very clear that territory is not strictly defined by force, but influenced by a mode of production, i.e. by an extent of settlement, trade, and economic activity. Stalin is arguing legal borders are downstream from that. You claim psychological makeup is immaterial, but rather ideal. So you are not a materialist. You realize Marxists subscribe to a materialist view of psychology, right? But alas, the best part about all of this is that you fail to grasp that materialism is not the same as metaphysical dualism. Ideas are involved in common culture, but that doesn't somehow make culture any less materially real. Your attempt to claim that nations are not materially real. Notice you changed your point. Before, you claimed that they didn't exist materially. Now you say they're a combination of material and ideal elements. On account of the fact that they are involved with ideas, involves basically any other category of Marxism, including a given mode of production itself. Capitalism also involves ideas. So do the existence of various classes. Now tell me, Colin, does this make it such that they are not materially real? Marx and Engels were themselves clear about how ideas are involved in history, how these exert an influence and play a role, and not just economics. But your mistake lies in conflating materiality for economics exclusively. The dialectical materialist outlook also accounts for the existence of ideas as materially real themselves, just not on the terms of the ideas themselves. And after all, proletarian consciousness is necessary for the proletarian class struggle to advance to a certain stage. Does this make it partially immaterial? Would you be willing to commit to the logical conclusion of your silly idealist view of nations? Or rather, are you yet again going to shift the goalposts and change your argument to somehow claim, in contrast and in contradiction to Stalin's view, that nations are actually just a superstructure themselves? You are dishonest and flip-flopping. I await to see what new mental gymnastics you are going to try and employ to get yourself out of this little mistake of yours. The idea that nations are a superstructure contradicts Stalin's view. This is explicitly evident in Stalin's writing on language, where he expressly rejects the notion that it is superstructural. He writes, quote, "In this respect, language radically differs from the superstructure. Language is not a product of one or another base, old or new, within the given society, but of the whole course of the history of the society and of the history of the bases for many centuries. It was created not by some one class, but by the entire society, by all the classes of the society, by the efforts of hundreds of generations. It was created for the satisfaction of the needs not of one particular class, but of the entire society, of all the classes of the society." Unquote. All of this is directly applicable to what Stalin likewise writes about nations. Even in that same text, quote, "The question is, do these ideas help the exploited and oppressed in their struggle for liberation?" Unquote. The question of who the subject of such a struggle is, what form they acquire, what context such a struggle takes in, the concrete content of liberation, etc. All of these are questions closely tied to the content of a given concrete historical and therefore national existence. The idea that you can begin with the conceit of an abstract humanity and an abstract liberation, and regard the concrete determination of the former as some ancillary detail, treated in a utilitarian matter as a vehicle to reach this ends, puts the cart before the horse. It defines the content of socialism in a formalistic, ideal way. How can you think to know anything about the liberation of anyone by, in your head, violently abstracting and uprooting them from the context of their actual collective existence, because you're just a bourgeois socialist? And that's being charitable. You somehow think that you know the goals of liberation, you know humanity, you know the proletarian subject, and meanwhile, the actual concrete form this takes is just some ancillary detail to be sorted out in a utilitarian manner. This is a reflection of your academically rooted idealism. All you have are thoughts, which you reify and confuse for actual reality. This is why you make silly statements, such as the idea that nations do not materially exist. They are immaterial insofar as you have to regard them with any significance in order to be a pencil-pushing parasitical piece of shit academic and published papers. But they are very material insofar as actual communists mean to regard the real form of class struggle in their country with any degree of seriousness or consideration. In sum, your goal is liberation. In other words, liberalism. My goal is the political supremacy of the proletarian class and smashing the political state machine, not for any abstract liberation, but only to follow through on the very logic and meaning of a world historical class struggle whose premises are already in existence, and in a way far more concrete than your liberation. Colin, it really feels like I am beating a dead horse at this point. If you do not respond to every single point of contention raised here substantively, I will regard that as a full and unequivocal surrender. New heading: The Professor Surrenders and Pivots. Colin's attempt to defend wokeness. Having been so utterly exposed for his lack of knowledge on the basics of Marxism-Leninism, Colin decided to settle for pivoting to a completely new undertaking. He has decided to launch a series that he has paywalled, which promises to go line by line through the essay "Marxism is Not Woke," pointing out the logical leaps, out of context quotes, and the half-baked readings of Lukács and Heidegger. Firstly, everyone can see the clearly dishonorable behavior Colin is engaging in. He is only ever willing to respond to my views when he can avoid incurring a response from me. In this case, by paywalling his article, or by branching off into a million new topics through the written medium. In this way, he does not actually engage with my views, but throws stones and runs away. To actually engage with my views would require that you expose yourself to the possibility that I might actually be able to respond to you. By refusing to engage in live debate, and thus demanding that I set aside all of my duties and responsibilities as executive chairman of the American Communist Party to educate him in particular for an indefinite period of time, and by paywalling his content, he preempts that possibility. So all he is actually doing is just coping with his actual inability to engage. Having failed to demonstrate rudimentary knowledge of Marxism-Leninism, Colin is now attempting to take shots at a past project of mine, which was made in response to far-right attempts to vilify Marxism. Marxism is not woke. Colin is a textbook example of a fascist collaborator who facilitates, from a leftist perspective, the attempt to associate all that is degrading or offensive to the national sentiments of the people with enemies of fascism, namely Marxists. He has paywalled the article for his own protection. By this, he probably means eventually being exposed yet again for his fraudulent pretensions to having knowledge of basic theory. The response will be uploaded in a separate audio. Thanks for listening to the audio version of an essay by Haz al-Din, the chairman of the American Communist Party.